Now we will start off with the first lecture with Professor SueAnne Ware. She's actually a friend of mine, an old friend of mine, and she was here in person back in 2018 and gave a talk. Currently, Professor SueAnne Ware is a professor of landscape architecture and the head of School of Architecture and the Built Environment at the University of Newcastle, Australia. She has more than 20 years of teaching experiences in many universities, such as RMIT, North Carolina State University. And Professor Ware has a design research practice approach which explores design activisms. She creates spaces that generate friction, where protests are permitted and possible, where attention is drawn to some of society's most pervasive issues, and passers-by may discover insight into what Professor Ware hopes is a more humanitarian and compassionate approach. Professor Ware is a co-founder of Outfit, an all-female collective of design practitioners and design volunteers who work in marginalized and disadvantaged communities. Outfit provides design and build services for women, domestic violence, refuge, underfunded schools for students with special needs, and indigenous community centers. She believes that landscape architects share a responsibility for exploring political, social, and environmental agendas in public spaces. Her design projects have won national and international awards, including Power Plants, Germinate, Honeysuckle Placemaking, St. Andrew's Bushfire Memorial, the Seth X Memorial, the Road as Shine, and the End Time Memorial to heroin overdose victims. Okay, today we welcome SueAnne back to give a talk on her ongoing research project on contaminated post-industrial sites in Australia and her experimental use of plants through methods of phytoremediation to heal these scarred landscapes. So right now we're going to start off with a video for SueAnne.
Thanks, Sylvia. While you're teeing it up, when she says old friends, she means like super old friends. So those of you who are doing masters, Sylvia and I did our masters together. So that's how old of friends we are.
Yes.
And if you give me some money, students, I don't know. If you give me a shout out on WeChat, I will tell you all Sylvia's very funny stories from grad school.
No funny stories. I'm a very serious person.
Is it gonna work? Otherwise, I can go straight into the lecture.
It's okay. It can work. Yeah. It's working. There it is.
Oops. So just to start this out, it's a 5-minute video and I won't talk over the top of it, but it was recently shown at the Venice Biennale in the Italian Pavilion. And I thought it was a good way to introduce sort of what we're doing in these projects to you. Right.
Okay, go, yes.
Humus, the life of the earth, has been respected and nurtured for millennia by indigenous nations. Not so the last few hundred years. Contaminated, post-industrial and mining sites proliferate across Australia. As human settlements encroach upon and eventually usurp these lands, the ground is literally poison.
Four generations of steel workers have worked on this site to make this country what it is and to make this city what it is. To you and to all of your families, I say to you, thank you and very best wishes for the future. You deserve the very best.
This film explores 2 brownfield landscape sites where phytoremediation gardens remove contaminants from the soil.
It celebrates and captures intertwining human and ecological regimes of care.
These sites are often overgrown with weeds, vacant, fenced off, and perceived as urban wastelands.
This is a story of two gardens, the Delprat Garden and the Whitebay Power Plant Garden.
The Delprat cottage site is located on the land of the traditional Indigenous owners, the Pambalong clan of the IWUL Nation, and sits on the edge of the former BHP steelworks site.
It looks at ephemeral and temporal processes of repair and reconnection through performative, playful and educated means.
The project will act as a living laboratory for our collaborators from the UTS Phyto Lab, whose team have had an opportunity to test soil, root, leaf and fruit of a wide range of plants.
I love the interface between science and art. Design is sort of a physical type of art. And so we can start to use biotechnology, using plants to decontaminate metals, but we can do it in a really beautiful and important way that's good for the community, as well as obviously scientifically good too.
It's about humans and how we care for the plants, and how by caring for the plants and ensuring their well-being, they're ensuring our well-being. It's a reciprocal relationship.
Everything is cyclical, everything's linked within a natural system. If you influence it in a certain way, you'll get an output in a different way. And nature is very good at balancing those particular situations and being quite resilient. And there's always disruption and change that occurs within them. But with an idea of the Anthropocene coming through, of people's effect being far larger on the environment than perhaps previously it being in some sort of balance, we now need to look at how we can insert into that to negate the negative effects that we have.
The gardens that we've been working on are all about regimes of care, how the plants are caring for the soil and how they're taking out toxins and how they're redeeming the land.
Phytoremediation is the process where we use plant-based biotechnology to clean up contaminated sites. This is a really great example of how we're using edible and flower species in a cottage-style planting to clean up some of the heavy metal contaminants left on this historic site. And so when we harvest these plants for science, we take the whole plant and we break them up into their different components. We look at what goes into the roots, what goes into the stems and the leaves and the fruits, because that helps us understand how effective these plant species are at cleaning the site, as well as the safety risks for things like your pollinator species, whether it's in the flowers or not, or your fruit species, so things like animals, possums, even humans. So it's really important to understand where metals go, regardless of whether they're cleaning the soils or not.
So when we look at sites like this, and we think about heavy industries, and we think about redundant or obsolete things that we know are happening in the world today, the potential of phytoremediation and the gardens to cleanse the soil is unlimited.
Thanks for that, Sylvia. So go ahead and put up some images for you. Let's see, I'll get out of here.
So you are your own technical support, right?
Yeah, I can do it, I promise. All right.
You've got it here.
Now, I'm just, whoa, can you see it? Yes, no.
Look of it. Oh, there we go.
And if I do full screen,
Control L.
I know, but yeah, I'm not working from the same computer as yesterday. Sorry. There you go. All right. Can you all see that? Big thumbs up.
We can see it, but it's not full screen. Is it
Uh-oh.
okay for you? I mean, we don't mind.
Well, up to you guys.
Oop.
Look, it's full screen on mine, but I can't see any of you.
I think with budget, we've lost the PDF. Please share again.
Okay, I'll do it again.
Yeah.
Sorry, kids. I am usually pretty good at this. Okay. You can see the PDF now? No.
Yes. Yes, we can see it.
Okay. So I thought it was best to show you the film, partially because you can see it again now, because it's got subtitles, and obviously if you heard my Mandarin, my Cantonese, or my Chinese or Japanese, Thai, you'd be very sad. I want to thank IWUL and Sylvia and BI for inviting me. I'm going to explain why the title is It All Began with Goats. So this is where I live, in Newcastle. If you look at the map, we're about 3 hours north of Sydney. So we're not in Sydney. We're not right next to Sydney. We're a long way away from Sydney. And what Newcastle is famous for is...
SueAnne, sorry,
yeah.
we only still see the cover page.
Okay, I don't know why it's not... I've shifted it, but...
Should we show it on our end?
Sure, if you want.
Or can you just put this arrow?
Do you want to show it on your end? Sorry.
That's okay. No worries. Just trying to figure out how to make it work. So we're going to share your PowerPoint. Is it the same, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just go to the second page.
Yeah, we'll show it full screen.
Don't know why it's not working. It was working on Saturday.
Yeah. Well, it
Yeah.
have a bit of problem.
That's right.
Already.
There you go. All right. So can you go to the second slide? Sorry. So this is Newcastle. Newcastle, as I was saying, is about 3 hours north of Sydney. What Newcastle is famous for is we actually export the largest amount of coal in the southern hemisphere. So hopefully that won't be the case much longer. But we have a number of former factory sites. It's a massive post-industrial and industrial port. And so we have some of the worst toxic spots in the country right in our town, which is about 300,000 people. Next slide. So this project began with looking at another project by an American called Brett McMullen, where he was getting developers to use goats instead of lawnmowers to keep the carbon emissions down. So rather than mowing sites that were sitting vacant waiting to be developed, he would put goats on them and get the goats to graze them. In doing this, he discovered something really interesting about goats and their guts, which is goats can actually eat lots of toxic plants and not die. And in fact, there's something in their stomach and some of their microbiology that allows them to break down really scary stuff that we find in pesticides, heavy metals that come off car parts, things like that. So the Belmont goats were initially about getting developers not to use lawnmowers and saving on carbon emissions. And then I decided I would propose it here for another use. Next slide, sorry. We have a number of, this is a disused rail corridor that no longer has trains on it. And it sat vacant for nearly 3 years before it got redeveloped. So this was one of the sites I proposed. Keep going. Sorry, I'm going to go through this pretty quick now. These are some vacant lots in and around town that basically have toxic soil stored on them, because in Australia, we can't move toxic soil off site. We just pile it up. And so you get these massive hills in the middle of flat places. And if you plant plants that take out toxins and graze it with goats that can take the toxins, what an amazing invention this might be. Now, next slide. So I was presenting this as a what if scenario that you often do as a professor, where you say, look at all these great things we could do. I'm not expecting anyone to take me seriously. But in the audience for this presentation, there happened to be someone from the state government who said, all right, I'll give you a site and I'll give you some money. So we did it. Next slide. And so I'm just going to explain a few little things. And again, I'm conscious that English isn't your first language, so I'm not going to get super technical or super scientific, but really phytoremediation is a process, and there's lots of things plants can and cannot do with toxins that are in the soils. Some plants actually absorb the toxins and it stays in their roots, or it stays in their stems, or it stays in their leaves, or in their flowers, or in their fruits or vegetables. Some plants can absorb the toxins actually break it down and metabolize it. And then through a process of evapotranspiration, or if you like when plants sweat, it actually will release the toxins and they won't be toxic anymore. So some plants actually can absorb and metabolize toxins. There's a whole range of different types of phytoremediation, and there's a whole range of plants who do it. And so both of these projects were really about looking at field trials and what can you do that has an aesthetic or a garden set in. Next slide. So we really wanted to do this in Newcastle, but in order to do anything in Newcastle, we had to prove ourselves in Sydney first. And so you'll see, you can't see my cursor, but the site that we started with was White Bay Power Station. It's a former power station right close to the centre of Sydney and the Opera House, just across the harbour. And it used to be a coal-fired power station that powered the trams that ran along the streets. Next slide. So when you get to see these kind of Google Earth images and the drone footage, you can kind of see that the building's in a state of disrepair. And the bit in the orange is really the site they gave us, which was a small site. So remember, this site is going to go into development fairly quickly. We had a year to work on site and to see if we could take out as much toxin as possible using plants. Next slide. This is kind of some of the, you can see quite actively, and again, I'll make these slides available. There is a lot of heavy metals, a lot of lead, a lot of things that you really don't want in your soil. If you're going to put apartment buildings, or if you're going to put a shopping complex, anything where people might come in contact with the soils, there were really dangerous amounts of toxins in these soils. Next slide. So the design's actually really simple for this one, and it's partially because it was a one-year turnaround and it had to be quick. So it's all annuals, and essentially what you see in the little circles, that's a monoculture. So it has a single species, and what you see in between the circles, the kind of dotty ones, the thicker ones, they're meadows. And so we were trying to test individual species, but then also test species that were planted as companions or a mix through meadows. Next slide. It's really hard to do this without your own pointer. And we were really looking at, for aesthetics, sort of layering up the plants the same way you would in any garden, but where you'd layer up the tallest in the back and the smallest in the front, and really so that you could see this garden from any edge. Next slide. We actually installed this whole thing, so we're all wearing hazmat suits, the research team and myself, so you'll see me in a little bit. Certainly the scientists were also involved in actually building the garden, so it's not something we paid a contractor to do. And even we worked with a couple of artists who made a different film who also helped us install the project. Next slide. So what we start to see, and again, this is a really quick turnaround, they're trying to develop the site. They want to get as many toxins as they possibly can and get some nutrients back in the soil. So in a very short period, basically the meadows came in and kind of took over their plots. And while there are obviously going to be weed species intermixed, because we're not weeding this, we're not caring for it like it's a garden, we got a heck of a lot of growth in a very short period of time. Keep going. Next slide. So the monoculture is a little bit different. Just in the PVC pipes, you just see a single species, and we started out with, basically seeds and a bit of hydromulch, and as you can see towards the end, it all got a bit feral. Next slide. We had to figure out, and again, this is the first of the field trials that we've done in Sydney, and this is the first garden. The second one gets a bit more sophisticated, but we really had to look at what was growing well, what wasn't growing, why. Some of the things that might be like lucerne puts other things back into the soils. Certainly the sunflowers took off, and because sunflowers take out things like DDT and lead, they're incredibly important for most toxic sites. Next slide. But I guess I want to talk about sort of the overall transformation of the site. So you can see in this kind of series, after 5 months, it becomes a pretty feral site. But on the other hand, it's also this site that we know had a lot more biodiversity and species diversity, which is another problem in itself that I'll talk about in the next project. Next slide. So we had to do things like look at what was growing well and what wasn't growing well. And so we have graphs. If you come to our website, you'll see all of this. Next slide. And you know, what was doing better, the things that were mixed up in a meadow or things that were singular, like a monoculture. And actually, we were the meadows really did the best in terms of both growth and in terms of toxin take-up. And we think that's because the plants work together to take up different toxins. Next slide. And then we kept track, of course, of the toxins that were being taken out. So each of these plots has a number which corresponds to the plant it is. And then each of the bar graphs that you see are the toxins that were being removed by those plants. Benzo is probably the worst thing that's on that site. So the very fact that we were able to get so much benzo out before they redeveloped it is a big deal. Now remember, this first garden is for a site that's going to be developed quite quickly. So we're trying to do something quick, cost effective, but also has results immediately, which is different to most phytoremediation gardens. Next slide. And this is the kind of before, and the next slide. That's the kind of after. So yes, it's still weedy, and yes, it still has a kind of, I would say, post-industrial aesthetic, but we know that we left the site better than what we found it. Next slide. So it's one thing to prove yourself in Sydney, where you don't live. It's another thing to prove yourself in Newcastle, where you do live. And it's a small community of about 300,000 people. And in order to do something here, we had to take a lot more chances, and we had to push the project a lot further. So you can see where Newcastle is. Sydney is that tiny little dot with a couple of nice buildings. Newcastle's where it's at. Sorry, I have to say that. Next slide. This garden's actually incredibly close to our CBD as well. So our central business district is about 6 kilometers away. You'll notice throughout this region, we have these amazing river systems, which is why we get coal in and out so quickly, because we can get large boats in and around the bay and get the coal down. But our rivers are incredibly distressed at the moment because of post-industrial uses, but they're the whole reason the cities are here in the first place. Next slide. So again, just to give you a little bit more context, I'll just scroll you through it. We're in that orange spot there. Next slide, sorry. So one of the reasons we selected this site is because it has this history. So whenever a steelworks goes, so basically Newcastle was formed around this steelworks and around coal. And then the steelworks decided to close down in the early 90s. And so you have all these post-industrial ruins, some of which you saw being blown up in the film. But you basically had a town that was centered around this industry. And then all of a sudden it's gone. So what happens? And people are very sentimental. Generations of people worked at this steel mill. And so it's really quite a contested thing, something that's so pollution, so bad for the environment and so bad for humans is something that is so loved and remembered so fondly. So we have this site that's quite contested. And so how do you deal with the kind of social side of something that you know is bad for the planet and is bad for people, but people are very attached to? And that's kind of one of the more interesting challenges with the Delprat cottage. Next slide. So we did a bit of research before we went on site. It was actually supposed to be a botanic gardens. It never eventuated. It became a steel factory instead. Because of its location next to the river. And here it is, you're starting to see the cottage being built. Now the cottage is called Delprat Cottage because the first CEO or the first guy who was in charge of the whole steel factory built his house right next to the steelworks because he wanted to watch all his workers. So it is his house, the site that we're starting with. Next slide. It's a little bit over 2 hectares. We're really only working in very discrete small patches. It has an amazing tree cover, which you'll see in some of the images. Big giant fig trees that have some significance to Indigenous people here. A fair few existing trees that we know once we start testing them that they've absorbed or haven't absorbed some of the toxins over the years. It's also still an active industry site, not the cottage site, but adjacent to it, as you'll see in some of the images. Next slide, sorry. So the site plan is really simple, and this is where I do need the pointer, but I don't have it. To the left of the house, you'll see what looks like a vegetable patch, and that's exactly what it is. Around the house, you'll see what looks like a cottage garden. Out in the paddocks a bit further where the cursor is now, or near where the cursor is now, is a series of orchards. And down at the bottom where you see that oval shape and the triangle shape at the very bottom, not to your right, to your right, to your right. There you go. No, there you go. That's a series of meadows. And so we planted 4 typologies for a reason. One, this is a demonstration project. Now, while we know that this site is heavily contaminated because we've done a lot of testing on it, just across the road, there's housing, and there's a lot of housing. So we know that those contaminants have leached over. The road doesn't stop the contaminants. It doesn't stop them going into the river, and it certainly doesn't stop them going into the housing next door. So we planted a very suburban garden, partially because we wanted people to be able to plant these things in their own gardens to take out toxins if they wanted to, or to know if they're growing vegetables in the ground next to their house, what might be safe to eat and what might not be safe to eat. Next slide. So this is just one that's gotten some pretty funny things in the PDF. This just labels what the gardens are. Next one. So this is kind of, as we do whenever you have to sell a project, I know you're all used to this. This is me convincing the former steel workers, this is what we're going to do to the bit around your house. This is me convincing the university and the state government, this is how we're going to spend what's left of the money you gave us. We want to do a vegetable garden. And I guess it's one thing to do Photoshop 101 and talk about the amenity of a garden, but it's another thing to talk about, well, if people are planting things like carrots or pumpkins, or if they're planting things like citrus, are they safe to eat? And this is the kind of work we're doing now. And this is obviously in collaboration with a scientist from the University of Technology, Sydney. But it's even the birds and the bees and say the other fauna and flora. So if you've got birds landing and pollinating your flowers, or you've got bees pollinating flowers, and then they take a toxin with them, it's really important to know if those flowers carry the toxins, right? Because that then can change, that whole series of ecological enchainments can be incredibly compromised. So a lot of what we're doing in these gardens is really testing different parts of the plants to see whether it absorbs toxins or not. And if it doesn't, that might mean it's safe to eat an apple from this orchard, even though the site's incredibly toxic. Next slide. So this is what it actually looks like, and our dog will feature in a few of these. She's really good at sneaking into pictures. And look, it's not a glamorous vegetable garden, but it looks like your typical suburban vegetable garden. Next slide. It's gone a bit feral over the course of a year. We've only been on this site for a year, and this is a very annually planted part of our project. We have other parts of the project which are much more 2, 3, 5, and 7, 10-year gardens. Next slide. But what's been interesting to date about it, other than having some very interesting, obviously we've got high lead concentration, so we see the sunflowers here again. Next slide. is the kinds of results that we're seeing from vegetable species. So what you see are beans, a bit of silver beet or beetroot, and some chives or onions, and just off screen is garlic. And the things that don't absorb the toxins are important to know, like I said, so that people, if they want to eat these, if they plant them and they happen to live in the same neighborhood, they won't get toxic food, or the things that are actually taking it out. For instance, carrots. Carrots are amazing at taking out lead. So if you know you live on a toxic site and you plant some carrots, you can actually get rid of the lead. Now, if you don't know and you eat a lead filled carrot, that's not really good for your system. And so we have incredible results coming out from the vegetables. Beetroot, actually, we thought the roots would hold because when you think about a beetroot underground, the big round kind of bulby structure, we thought the roots would hold the toxins, but actually it ended up being in the leaves. This is really important field data that others have done a little bit on in laboratories, but not really testing it out in the field. Next slide. So here's our scientist. She's testing bell peppers. You do get some weird and wild shapes of vegetables, some really strange colors. There are plants that actually, the way they absorb and they evaporate the toxins, it turns them a different color than what it's supposed to be, and we call them litmus plants. Next slide. So the second garden is really a shrub border or a cottage garden. So those of you who live in Hong Kong probably know about these weird kind of English gardens where they kind of fluffy it up. We tend to plant them around the bottom of a house to cover up the foundation. It's a very English or Australian or even American kind of typology. And what we wanted to do here was plant things that weren't annual, weren't edible, but things that people would typically plant out the front of their house, just to find out whether or not they were absorbing toxins out of the soil. So this is the image of what it was going to look like. Next slide. And this is the image of what it really looks like. It's a little bit weed infested at the moment. We haven't done enough gardening. But this is an interesting study because we're doing both natives and non-natives. Now, if you've never been to Australia, it's really important to understand that we have very distinct native species here that people love. They see it as a part of the Australian identity. And a lot of people plant natives in their gardens to attract birds and other and bees and native fauna. But the thing is that can they take toxic soil and can they take toxins out of the soil? We know a lot about American plants because that's where most of the trials have taken place with phytoremediation, a bit in the UK, but we don't know a lot about Australian plants. So the variety of plants here are both Australian, English. There are actually some Asian plants as well because Australia, as you know, has borrowed a fair few Asian source plants over the years. Next slide, to do with things that are more drought resistant and things that can cope in our environments. And what you start to see around the cottage garden, again, it's pretty early days, it's been in it about 8 months, is that we're still getting the fantastic blooms that you would expect in a kind of flowery cottage garden, but they're doing kind of weird and wacky things that we didn't anticipate. Now, we won't test these for another 2 or 3 years because we have to remove the whole plant when we do the tests. Next slide. And these are the kinds of things that you kind of typically see. The one in the middle, we think, the scientist thinks, Megan thinks that one of the reasons that it's gone this kind of strange color is that actually it's absorbing some iron. On a steel factory, there's a lot of iron in the soil, not very healthy. And she thinks actually it's absorbing the iron and it's coming out in the color of the flowers, which is kind of interesting again. Next slide. So these are, once again, Juno's featured. These are the kind of Photoshop images of the orchards. I know you guys are all excited about plants. This is what they'll look like in 25 years when the trees grow. Next slide. This is what they look like now. Funny, the dog didn't move, did she? What's been fascinating about the orchards to date is obviously we're not sampling the trees yet because they're not big enough and we're not going to remove them for a while. But the grass species that we underplanted the trees with have gone insane. Now, if you know anything about grasses, they tend to have really fibrous roots, right? They have really rhizomatic or fibrous, kind of like really almost carpet roots that happen underneath the top of the soil. And what that does is it's much more impactful in terms of taking out toxins if the grasses absorb toxins. And what we do know about things like femina and more native grasses in Australia is that they can definitely take toxins like what we see on this site, but it looks like they're also removing a lot of toxins. So grasses work fast because of their root structure. They hold the toxins in their roots. And so one of the other experiments that we're currently doing is around composting. We're taking out some of the plants and testing them, but other plants we're taking and we're putting into a barrel composter. We can't remove plants from the site, right? Because that would be taking plants off site and taking toxins off site other than to go to the lab. So when the compost, we're not putting the compost back on site because it would just be adding the toxins back in. But when we do the composting, essentially, we then test the sludge at the bottom of the compost to see how much has been taken out. Ah, thanks for that. Next slide. Whoops. So these are these little baby orchards. You'll notice a crepe myrtle. We have a lot of those in Australia, a few eucalypts. Next slide. And they're just at the very beginning of the cycle. The last bit, which is probably my favorite, and it might be an aesthetic preference. I kind of have a Piet Olaf moment every now and again. I wish I was him, haha. It are these kind of less formal meadows. Now, the reason meadows are really important with phytoremediation isn't just because they have a variety of species that take up different toxins. It's because of the carpeted approach. Again, they can cover vast amounts of land, big swatches of land, and take out toxins fairly quickly. So the first meadow that we planted, next slide, had a really interesting, so you can kind of see it getting a bit feral there. Next slide is fine. It kind of did really well. These are cornflowers. Those are little blue flowers that you see. And it got a fair bit of coverage very quickly. You can mow meadows. You can do lots of other kinds of regimes of care if you like. Next slide. And we were getting some really fantastic looking kind of, as you can see, spectacular blue fields. Next slide. And we're going along really well. And then, as always in Australia, whenever you've got a garden doing really well, you get 4 days of over 50 degrees heat and the thing dies. Because we don't water the meadows at all. We water some of the cottage gardens and certainly the vegetable patch, but we don't water the meadows. So next slide. So we did get some interesting, and this is how it looks now. Actually, it's been mown a bit, but it's pretty dead. We'll be planting our next meadow fairly soon. But again, it gets out. So we were able to get out benzene, DDT, a bit of zinc and a bit of magnesium with our first meadow. And so we're going to push pretty hard on a different set of species to get out other things. But meadows are quite quick, easy to care for, and they look really brilliant in spring. They tend to go a bit feral, and that's why I like them. They get a bit weedy and they're not so kept. But they allow us to have annual plant testing alongside of when we have longer term testing. Next slide. So I just want to talk really briefly about the outreach aspect of this project. So it's one thing to build a website or to give a few lectures to budding landscape architects, but what's really important about this work is the advocacy for our communities. Newcastle isn't a wealthy place by any means. We have some of the largest socioeconomic disadvantaged people in the country living with us. And so part of our job is to educate others about what could be going on in their own yards or what could be going on in parks. And we do a lot of tours and talks to people who will listen, who are interested in doing their own gardens and thinking about their own soils. Next slide. We recently had an exhibition, and really this was an exhibition about resilience, which is kind of interesting, the theme of your workshop. And we were really trying to get people sort of seduced by the plants and kind of really interested in the ethnobotanic, but also how beautiful plants are when they're drawn, these kind of beautiful drawings. Next slide. And so we've come up with a series of postcards where it'll tell you the plant species, it'll tell you their ethnobotanic significance, and also tell you what toxins they take out. So you basically have a set of playing cards or a set of postcards, or when you go online, you can get them digitally, which tell you a lot about plants that you can do this. So we're really pushing the open source. You know, you too, if you've got lead in your garden, you should, or if you've got boron problems, you know, you should plant some jack pumpkins. Next slide. There's a heck of a lot of species, that we're using that are native. These are eucalypts and a lemon myrtle that we don't know if they take out toxins because no one's tested them before. So a lot of this is pretty cutting edge. We don't know, but you know, it's really important that if you think about the number of street trees and the number of backyard trees in a place like Australia, which is not as dense, obviously, as Hong Kong, or even just the kinds of plants people put out their front porch, it's really important to understand whether they absorb toxins or not, even just if we're looking at pollinators and bees and other things, so we know whether or not they're absorbing the toxins with them. Next slide. The other thing we've done is we've created a do-it-yourself guide, teaching people how to take soil samples and showing them places that will test their soil samples for free. Next slide. Teaching people how to care for plants, what to do if it's being eaten by moths, you know, the kind of gardening guru 101, really talking about the fact that you can't tell generally if plants are taking in toxins. They look perfectly healthy, and until you send them off to the lab, you don't discover whether or not they're actually taking out toxins. Next slide. And teaching people how to sample plants. If they want to find out if their favorite magnolia tree or if their favorite sunflower is taking up toxins, how do you sample it? How do you send it to a laboratory? How do you make sure that you're not contaminating it with other things before you get it tested? We talk a lot about how to, once you find out if you do have toxic soils, we talk a lot about how if you do want to do a phytoremediation garden in your own backyard, what you can do with your compost, what you shouldn't do with your compost, what you shouldn't do with your soil. Next slide. Almost there. I just kind of want to end on this. So obviously we're on this side of the fence, but what you can see in the background of this slide is a very large container ship, right? It's basically loaded up with coal. So normally that ship would be super tall, but it's probably about 3/4 of the way full and getting ready to go back out. On the left, before you see the ship on the other side, you see several fairly large, I'll say industrial land uses. So these are happening right now, every day, all day. And as much as I'd like to say that the Australian government is going to finally let go of fossil fuels and take care of the planet, as long as it's economically viable to do so, I don't see it happening. But what we're hoping to do with this project certainly is to jump the fence into the industrial site. And we've had a few approaches. I do think that as landscape architects and architects, we often get quite attached to these kind of post-industrial, weedy, terrain vague, you know, these kind of sites that are kind of, I don't know, they can't be developed because they're so toxic, or they're kind of ruins, you know, and we get quite romantically attached to them. And certainly I understand that, but I guess what I would say is that we created these places, and certainly my generation and those before me spent a lot of time creating these industrial sites. And what I hope as a landscape architect, and as what I hope for you as future landscape architects, is that you help us unmake these sites. and that you help us uncreate these sites. And I'm not interested in it going back to bushland. I fully accept that it's going to be in a city or in suburbia, but I do think that if we know that we can create these kind of constructed ecologies that can renew the sites, that has to become part of what we do for our profession. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions. I hope I haven't gone too over, Sylvia.
No, not at all. Perfect timing. Thank you. Thank you, SueAnne, for such a inspiring and fun experimentation. Yeah, right on time. And I'm sure we all have a lot of questions to ask SueAnne, but I think we will allow the floor, for the rest of the schools to speak first. And the way we like to arrange this is you could either speak up directly and the screen will automatically go to the speaker, or you can type. And so we will monitor the different questions. Don't be shy. And the DI students and tutors just have to hold until everybody asks the questions. Okay, anyone at all from the universities? I'm not going to go through each school, so feel free to speak.
It's funny because usually I'm doing more socially engaged projects. So, and I do a lot of workshops in Guangzhou with villages.
I know,
so
yes.
It's funny not to be talking about that work to a group that's about to be doing work in a traditional village. But I guess I'm trying to present to you some of your future work when you come and take over Australia and really start showing us better practices, given that you're a green blue and the green infrastructure that I think Asia is starting to put in place, whereas I think Australia is sort of ignoring it. Mm-hmm. We all come to learn from you, which we often do. I'm hoping that you teach us better.
Okay.
Okay. So
hey,
I'm from TCU, and yes, thank you very much for your nice introducing the good case on the brown fatal origination. Actually, I think it will be a very interesting case also in Japan. So I know it's a little bit sensitive issue, but there is also the case in the Fukushima, where they considered this. Yes, they are thinking about planting some canola flowers. Also, there's some flowers, okay, but however, there are some issues that are quite sensitive because the heavy metals and the radioactive matters are totally different, right? So do you have any idea to how to manage it, or how to back to the nature? So it is a little bit difficult questions, but yeah.
No,
please.
So one, people don't always want to know, nor do the government want people to know that they live next to a toxic site. That's the first one. Even if it's a fairly well-known toxic site. So that there's the managing the public aspect of this has been really interesting. So one body would allow us to have everything we wanted to do open source, talk about the levels of toxins we found, no big deal. Another said no. What's interesting about, at least my understanding of what's going on at Fukushima and some of the things they did at Vietnam, because Vietnam had some similar issues, not necessarily as bad in terms of radioactivity, but certainly in terms of Agent Orange and DDT. They had really great trials with really quick crops, like what you're talking about. And then they could only get a certain amount out that way because it had polluted the groundwater. And so we've got a problem here where PFAS, which is what they use to when they're thinking about, it's like a fire retardant when they're putting out planes, and they're really trying to, at airports, when they're trying to make sure that nothing catches on fire, they spray this stuff. It got into the water source here, and they're using hemp, which is very interesting. Not the TCP kind, but they are really trialing a whole range of things. The radioactive one is radioactive and asbestos are the two hardest things to get out of soil. What they've tried in South Australia, which had some radioactive sites in it, I don't know how. Okay, Maralingo, they've tried a few things. a few native salt bushes. They've been okay, but further south, they've trialed a few different cotton species. And it's all about the species and how long you leave it in. But again, you can't, if you go to remove it, okay, let's say the cotton absorbs it, then it's radioactive. What the hell do you do with it? And you can't compost it. So that's been one of the fascinating things to me, is that set of enchainments. It's one thing to take it out and get it in the plant, but it's another thing to say, well,
how do you get rid of it? Yeah.
Yeah, actually, it is a really difficult problem, but yeah, thank you very much for your answer and think about you. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I see. Nam.
Yeah, so I'd like to ask you about NIMBY and how to convince visitors to come closer. Okay. Well, it's interesting because when we did the Newcastle, unlike the Sydney site, we weren't allowed to bring the public in except for on special excursions. But this is in a neighborhood. And because most of the people that are coming to our open days and our events actually live in the neighborhood, they want to know. But Newcastle has always been this industrial city. So everyone knows, it's a very well-known fact that we have very toxic soils here. And so I have to say that in other parts of Australia where people think it's pristine, it's not, but people think it is, they would never allow, like they would just be too freaked out. But in Newcastle, we know how damaged our soils are, because basically industry's been here since the turn of the century, and people have been, they've had documented, recorded illnesses because of how toxic it can be. The whole place used to be covered. There's still images everywhere with black soot because of the coal and the burning. And even now, where we used to live, we're still in a dodgy bit, but where we were, you'd have to dust every day and you just get black soot everywhere. So in a sad sort of way, we live in a part of Australia that fully accepts that the land is toxic, and we've chosen economic over health. But as generations change, people are less accepting, and certainly we understand climate change very well here. We've got massive issues to deal with sea level rise and urban heat island effect as well. And so what we're seeing is a change in, okay, we don't want to accept these things. What can we do with the residue? But yeah, certainly the Sydney project we had to be very quiet about, as opposed to the Newcastle project, where everyone in the state knows that Newcastle is highly toxic.
Interesting. There's a second part to the question.
Yeah, so so the vegetable one's interesting, because what we're finding in our studies is that some vegetables don't absorb any toxins, so they'll be safe to eat right away, because for whatever reason, they're toxin resistant. Other vegetables like carrots tend to be the things that tend to go in the ground with roots that get big, that you eat the root. So carrots, parsnips, the kind of root kind of vegetables, you don't want to eat those. You certainly wouldn't want to eat the sunflower seeds. But what we found, and there was a little short in it with our scientist Megan, some of the flowers, like we had these great pumpkins and we had these great watermelons grow this year. The flowers were fine, nothing, so the bees could pollinate and then something could eat the bees, no problem. But if you ate the pumpkin, you'd be sick. So what we can't, because obviously, fruit is basically the pollinated flower. So we couldn't work out, well, why did, in this case, it was lead. Why did the pumpkin absorb it, but not the flower? Which is, again, part of what our scientists team are trying to work out. So it's very specific to the vegetable, very specific to how much toxin and what toxin it is. But we are finding ones that are totally toxin, they grow fine, they're incredible. We also had an incredible crop of beans, and then one day they all died all at once. So they got to a point and we had beans on the vine, they were looking really amazing, and then they all just cacted at once. And it wasn't a hot day, so we think they got to a point at which they hit a tipping point and they got too much toxins. So it's a really interesting thing. So not all vegetables absorb.
Interesting. Okay. Okay. Any other questions? No one from the other universities?
Oh, I have a
They're
question.
dying to ask.
I
Oh,
think-
Darwin,
hello.
hi.
Hey.
Hi,
Finally, you're here.
I was a little bit late.
It's all right. No worries.
Yeah, I'm Young Min from University of Seoul, and thank you for your great presentation. And I have a question about your phytoremediation design strategy, because normally, and your project was kind of it was controlled, because phytoremediation, basically it's moving the contaminants to like soil, air, to the plants. So some of the contaminants are dissolved, but as I understand, the contaminants remain in that plant. So plant is basically contaminated. And I know there's a pros and cons, and some kind of sometimes it's more dangerous than just like leaving it there. Like the leaves are contaminated, and it's just like spread it out, and pollens and like that. So how do you kind of tackle those kind of issue? So when the plants absorb the contaminants, and the plant itself is contaminated, and then it can be spread it out through the water and.
Of course. Well, actually, it's worse to leave it in the soil because of groundwater. So we're talking. The first site is next to the ocean in Sydney, next to a bay. The second site is next to a river in Newcastle. So by leaving the toxins in the soil, you're basically allowing the groundwater to be contaminated. So, but of course, there are instances where it's safer to leave it in the soil, and you just let it. Although I don't know, I'm a bit nervous about leaving any toxins in the soil. I think there's different types of plants, and there are different types of phytoremediation. And again, there are ones that actually, there's plants that can absorb the toxins, and they're metabolic. The way they metabolize it can actually break it down into things that aren't harmful. We see those with the benzonine plants. So the plants that, like the Aranthus, the way that they deal with benzonine is they don't store it in their bodies. They actually somehow metabolize it and render it harmless. So it depends on the toxin, but you're right. You're basically removing the toxins out of the soil and putting them into where other things like pollinators, where birds, where foxes and squirrels and everything else can eat them. However, in this instance, and look, we say this openly, what happens now in our country is people put a cap on it, right? We'll put a giant cap over the toxic soil, and then eventually that cap gets breached and it leaks and it creates a bigger problem. Or they scrape the soil and put it somewhere else and make it someone else's problem. So we now have laws in Australia that says you can't scrape the soil and remove it and put it somewhere else. Or if you do it, it costs you so much money, you wouldn't do it. Caps are still the easiest and usually the way that it's treated now, except for that caps fail. Time and time again, caps fail. We know that from tip sites, we know that from mining sites, we know that from virtually every site that's been capped. Eventually that cap gets breached, and so then that creates a problem later on. And I guess you're right, we are putting it out there, but because you can't put a giant bubble over the top, right, and make sure no birds or anything else come in. But what I would say is that you can remove and safely dispose of the plant easier than you can scrape the soil. And then if you can still use that soil, if it's still healthy, which it is by the time it's gone through phytoremediation, you're actually renewing something in place. Okay. But the jury's still out, and like, to be honest with you, I'm pretty curious about trees, because obviously trees grow on toxic sites all the time. So if trees are absorbing toxins and holding them, but it's not killing them, do trees actually offer us a different kind of, maybe they're not metabolizing it, but trees don't generally leave the site. Maybe they just hold it in their root. Maybe trees are the answer. again, heavily dependent on the types of toxins and the site, but it's a great point.
Okay, anyone else? If not, would you still like to ask? Okay, we have Monica here. You might not be able to see her.
I can see her.
Hi, thanks for your sharing. Actually, I have, it's not a question, but more like a sharing. Actually, phytoremediation was my bachelor's graduation project topic. So the site was Laos. We were studying the China-Laos railway. I think it's all constructed now, but back in like 2-3 years ago, it was still in design stage. But then we were making different scenarios, how the railway would bring in different like changes to the landscape. And what I was looking at was cash crop plantations, because there at that time there has been already a lot of Chinese investment. They were kind of like renting land from the farmers, local farmers, and growing bananas specifically. And there were even, of course, they were heavily using chemicals and pesticides. And there were even workers who worked on the plantations and died on site because of the chemicals. And so what I did was I was trying to foresee what would happen in the future if the land is so contaminated, how and when these investors, when they get what they want and leave the site, what could the local people do with the land? And at that time, there were not a lot of information at all. But then I actually proposed different stages because I saw poplar and willow trees are very good at taking up heavy metals. But at my review, I got asked how I'm gonna do with these trees, because they are very fast growing, which means they would die very soon as well. So what do I do with the very contaminated tree? You can't leave it in the soil, and because then the heavy metals would just go back to the soil. And then I was thinking, at that time, I couldn't give an answer. I actually went speechless, also because very sleep deprived. But then after that, I was thinking whether there would be plants where they store the heavy metal in parts that are more stable, like the seed, where you can just hide them and leave them dry and never let them germinate, or in the wood part where you can process that into other products and just leave them there in a very stable form. I'm not sure if there are some new research that could give an answer to this, but if there is, yeah, I think that would be like.
So there's a Michel Desvignes project in Paris, outside of, just on the edge of Paris. My French is even worse. But my French is worse than even my Mandarin. But it's called Ile de Sequel, and they did. So it used to be the Renault car factory, and it's an island in the Seine River in Paris. And what they did there is they planted the willows. We can't plant willows in Australia; they're an invasive species. So that's one of the reasons. Well, also we don't have enough water. But what they're doing with the willows at Ile de Sequel, because they're full of contaminants, what they ended up doing with them is really interesting. So they removed them after they took out the toxins, and they then did a whole series of they actually, willow wood, if you know it, it's really supple and you can bend it into furniture and stuff, which then we're like, ooh, toxic furniture. But they were able to actually laminate the timber and the wood to do some really interesting things, and the toxins wouldn't release. But in Ile de Sequel, what's interesting about all the toxins they took out there and that wood, they actually made it an open process so people could see how much it was taking out. They made it an open process so people could actually know that those willows were doing a different job to what normal plants would do. But what I found interesting about them saying, okay, now we've got all this toxic wood, what do we do with it? They actually found ways to laminate it into flooring and other kind of products that they knew people weren't going to lick.
Yeah, I wonder if there's a way to neutralize the contaminants.
Probably, again, it probably depends on what the contaminants are. I mean, I think
exactly.
I think what's interesting about the poplars, because France also uses poplars in and around Nice to do the same thing. What they've found is that if they pollard them, so that's just where you cut you make it kind of knobby. If they pollard them, where it holds the toxins is really different to if they just allow it to grow. So imagine heavily pruning a poplar tree, and you're pruning it in such a way that it's only going to hold the toxins in its basal stem, its main stem, as opposed to all its little offshoots. And then the thing that they have to dispose of is that massive stem, but the offshoots don't have the toxins in it. And again, it all depends on the plant and its physiology. It's really fascinating. But eventually you will have to deal with the toxic plant itself. And that's where this kind of barrel composting, where you actually could compost that wood as it you're not going to remulch it, but you can actually get composting down to like something like 1/1600th of what it is, and then you've got this sludge that you actually have to dispose of appropriately. That's another thing that we're trialing it now, but others are trialing it all over the world.
Yes. So yeah, answer your question. Okay, thank you. So if there's no more questions, then we just want to thank SueAnne.
Thank you for having
the lecture.
I'm sorry, I have to
go. Clap.
Have a great workshop, and I look forward to seeing what happens.
Thank you. Thank you again. Okay.
Thank you, SueAnne.